Hey guys, tonight we begin with something seductive, scandalous, and absolutely ruthless. The secret queens of Europe who never wore a crown but wielded more power than any monarch. These weren't just beautiful women keeping kings company. They were master manipulators, political architects, and shadow rulers who toppled ministers, declared wars, and built empires from silk sheets and whispered promises. Tonight, you're not just learning about history, you're diving into the bedchambers where real power was negotiated. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're a nobleman in 18th century Versailles, and you need royal favor to save your family estate from bankruptcy. Do you petition the king directly? Schedule an audience through proper channels? Write a formal letter? Number U. Bow deeply to a woman in silk who isn't the queen, isn't married to anyone important, and technically has no official power whatsoever. Because in the glittering world of European courts, the real decisions weren't made in throne rooms or council chambers. They were made in private apartments, during intimate dinners, and in beds where passion mixed with politics in ways that would reshape continents. The royal mistress wasn't just a romantic dalliance, she was an institution, a parallel government operating in the shadows, where influence flowed through perfumed letters and pillow talk could determine the fate of nations. These women understood something that many legitimate queens never grasped. In a world where marriage was political arrangement, genuine attraction was the ultimate currency. And they spent it wisely. Welcome to a world where love was war by other means, where a strategically timed caress could be worth more than 1,000 soldiers, and where the wrong woman in the right bed could bring down dynasties. Tonight, we're not talking about powerless victims or simple courtesans. We're talking about women who turned seduction into statecraft and passion into policy. Women who proved that in the Game of Thrones, the queen on the board isn't always the most powerful piece. Let's start with the most notorious of them all. Madame de Pompadour, born Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, a commoner's daughter who became the unofficial Queen of France for nearly 20 years. But here's what the history books often miss. She wasn't just beautiful, though she certainly was. She wasn't just charming, though charm practically dripped from her fingertips. She was brilliant, calculating, and possessed a political mind that would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Picture young Jeanne, barely out of her teens, standing before a mirror in her modest middle-class home, practicing court etiquette she'd learned from books. Her mother had prophesied she'd one day catch the eye of a king, but prophecies don't prepare you for the brutal reality of court politics. At 19, she married a wealthy tax collector, a respectable match that should have secured her a comfortable, anonymous life. Instead, she used her new position to infiltrate Parisian high society, learning the language of power while pretending to be just another pretty face at endless soirees. The meeting with Louis XV wasn't chance. It was choreographed seduction, a masterpiece of strategic positioning that took months to arrange. Pompadour had studied the king's habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. She knew he was bored with his current mistress, frustrated with his ministers, and hungry for intellectual stimulation that his wife couldn't provide. When they finally met at a masked ball in 1745, she wasn't just another woman hoping to catch a royal attention. She was a woman who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Within months, she'd moved into Versailles, not as a temporary diversion, but as a permanent fixture. Louis didn't just desire her body, he craved her mind. She could discuss philosophy with Voltaire, debate economics with ministers, and plan military campaigns with generals. More importantly, she understood that the king's greatest weakness wasn't lust, it was loneliness. She became his confidant, his advisor, his political partner disguised as his lover. But here's where Pompadour's genius really showed. As she aged and her physical relationship with the king evolved, she didn't lose power, she transformed it. She became the gatekeeper to royal favor, the woman who decided which. Ministers kept their positions, which artists received commissions, which policies became law. Ambassadors from across Europe courted her approval. Philosophers dedicated works to her. Even the Queen, Marie Leschinska, recognized that Pompadour held the real influence at court. She turned her apartments into the true seat of government, hosting salons where politics was discussed under the guise of culture. Military strategies were planned between poetry readings. Trade agreements were negotiated during intimate dinners. She corresponded with Frederick the Great of Prussia, advised on the 7 Years' War, and single-handedly shifted France's foreign policy. When ministers disagreed with her, they found themselves suddenly dismissed. When nobles offended her, they discovered their pensions mysteriously cut. Pompadour understood that in a monarchy, access was everything. She controlled who saw the king and when, what information reached his ears, which problems demanded his attention. She didn't need to sit on the throne because she was the throne, at least the part that mattered. Louis might have worn the crown, but Pompadour directed where it looked. Her influence extended far beyond France. She commissioned the Encyclopedia, that radical collection of Enlightenment thought that would eventually help topple the very monarchy she served. She patronized artists who created the Rococo style that defined an era. She built chateaux that became centers of European culture. Through her support of exploration and trade, she helped expand French influence in India and North America. A woman who started life as a middle-class nobody shaped the intellectual and cultural development of the 18th century in ways that legitimate queens could only dream of. When she died in 1764, the entire European balance of power shifted. Louis XV, lost without his partner, made increasingly erratic decisions that weakened France's position on the world stage. The ministers she'd kept in line began pursuing their own agendas. The delicate network of influence she'd built over 2 decades crumbled in months. Her death didn't just mark the end of a love affair, it marked the beginning of the end for the old regime itself. Now, let's travel east to a woman who made Pompadour look subtle by comparison. Catherine Dolgoruki, mistress to Tsar Alexander II of Russia, who didn't just influence policy from the shadows. She rewrote the rules of imperial succession and nearly triggered a revolution in the process. But Catherine wasn't content to be a hidden influence. She demanded recognition, legitimacy, and power that no mistress in Russian history had ever claimed. Alexander first noticed 14-year-old Catherine when she was just a schoolgirl at the Smolny Institute. He was already in his 40s, married to Empress Maria Alexandrovna, and ruling over the largest empire on earth. But something about this young girl's fierce intelligence and startling beauty obsessed him. For years, he watched her grow up, sending gifts, letters, subtle signs of his interest. When she turned 18, he made his move, not with the casual entitlement of a monarch claiming a mistress, but with the desperate passion of a man utterly consumed. Their affair wasn't just scandalous because of the age difference or the adultery. It was revolutionary because Catherine refused to accept the traditional role of royal mistress. She didn't want to be hidden away in secret apartments, receiving discreet visits and anonymous gifts. She wanted to be seen, acknowledged, treated as if she were his equal. And somehow, incredibly, Alexander agreed. Catherine moved into the Winter Palace, not in servants' quarters but in rooms adjacent to the imperial family. She attended state functions, not hiding in the background, but seated prominently near the throne. Foreign ambassadors were expected to acknowledge her, court her favor, treat her almost like a second empress. The legitimate Empress Maria was humiliated, the nobility was outraged, and diplomatic protocol was turned upside down. But Catherine's ambitions went far beyond social recognition. She wanted political power, and she got it. Alexander began consulting her on matters of state, showing her confidential documents, bringing her into meetings with ministers. She didn't just influence his personal decisions, she helped shape policy for an empire that stretched from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. Her opinions on military strategy, domestic reform, and foreign relations carried weight that would have been shocking for any woman in 19th century Russia, let alone a mistress barely out of her teens. The scandal reached a crescendo when Empress Maria died in 1880. Within weeks, Alexander married Catherine in a secret ceremony, making her Princess Yuryevskaya and legitimizing their children. The Russian Orthodox Church was horrified. The nobility threatened revolt. European courts buzzed with outrage. Alexander had violated one of the most sacred traditions of monarchy, the separation between official marriage and personal passion. Catherine's influence on Russian policy during this period was profound and often disastrous. She encouraged Alexander's liberalizing tendencies, supporting reforms that weakened traditional power structures. She pushed for military adventures that drained the treasury. Her hatred of the conservative nobility led to policies that alienated the very people whose support the monarchy needed to survive. She was brilliant, passionate, and politically tone-deaf in ways that would have long-term consequences for the Romanov dynasty. When Alexander was assassinated by revolutionaries in 1881, Catherine's world collapsed overnight. The new Tsar, Alexander III, despised her and everything she represented. She was stripped of her position, her influence, her security. Her children were relegated to minor noble status. She fled Russia in disgrace, spending her remaining years in exile, a living reminder of how quickly royal favor could turn to royal fury. But Catherine's legacy extended far beyond her personal downfall. Her demand for recognition had shattered the traditional boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate power. Future mistresses would remember her example, her refusal to accept invisibility. And the scandal of her quasi-marriage had weakened the mystique of imperial dignity in ways that contributed to the eventual collapse of the monarchy itself. From Russia, let's journey to Britain, where the concept of royal mistress took on entirely different dimensions. Meet Alice Keppel, mistress to King Edward VII, who transformed the role from scandalous secret to acknowledged institution. But Alice wasn't just tolerated by British society, she was embraced by it, accepted by the royal family, and celebrated as a civilizing influence on a notoriously difficult king. Alice was born into minor gentry, married respectably to a military officer, and should have lived out her days in comfortable obscurity. Instead, she possessed something that caught the attention of the future king, an ability to manage difficult men with humor, intelligence, and unshakable composure. When she met Edward in 1898, he was still Prince of Wales, a middle-aged playboy famous for his appetites and his temper. Previous mistresses had either bored him or inflamed his worst tendencies. Alice did neither. What made Alice unique wasn't just her beauty or her wit, though she had both in abundance. It was her understanding that Edward needed a partner who could navigate the complex social and political demands of his position. She became his unofficial private secretary, his diplomatic advisor, his social coordinator. While his wife, Queen Alexandra, focused on royal ceremony and family duties, Alice handled the delicate business of managing Edward's relationships with politicians, foreign dignitaries, and the press. Alice's dinner parties became legendary, not for their extravagance, but for their strategic importance. She brought together people who needed to meet but couldn't do so officially. Controversial politicians found themselves seated next to conservative ministers. Foreign ambassadors discovered themselves chatting with radical journalists. Business leaders encountered labor organizers. Through careful social choreography, Alice helped Edward build coalitions, defuse tensions, and advance policies that official channels couldn't touch. Her influence on foreign policy was particularly significant. Edward's role in the Entente Cordiale with France, the alliance that would prove crucial in World War I, was facilitated by Alice's careful cultivation of French diplomatic wives. She spoke perfect French, understood European court culture, and could navigate the delicate social rituals that often determined political outcomes. While Edward provided the royal prestige, Alice provided the strategic thinking that made diplomatic breakthroughs possible. What was revolutionary about Alice's position was its openness. Unlike mistresses of previous eras who were hidden, denied, or merely tolerated, Alice was welcomed into the very highest levels of British society. Queen Alexandra not only accepted her presence but genuinely liked her. The royal children treated her with affection and respect. Cabinet ministers consulted her opinions. Foreign royalty paid court to her. She had achieved something that no royal mistress before her had managed: complete social acceptance. This acceptance came with responsibilities. Alice understood that she represented not just herself, but the institution of royal mistress. She was unfailingly discreet, never gossiping about private conversations, never using her position for personal financial gain, never creating scandals that might embarrass the monarchy. She dressed appropriately, spoke carefully, and conducted herself with a dignity that impressed even the most conservative members of society. Alice's political influence was subtle but real. She helped steer Edward away from his more reactionary impulses, encouraging his support for social reform and democratic development. Her salon became a meeting place for progressive politicians who might otherwise have struggled to gain royal attention. Through her influence, Edward became a more effective constitutional monarch than anyone had expected. When Edward died suddenly in 1910, Alice's grief was genuine and profound. She had lost not just a lover, but a partner in one of the most successful political partnerships of the era. Queen Alexandra's first act was to invite Alice to see Edward's body, a gesture of respect that acknowledged the reality of their relationship. Alice's final words to the dead king, spoken in the presence of his wife, were a perfect encapsulation of her role. "I loved him so much, and he loved me." Alice's legacy extended far beyond her personal relationship with Edward. She had redefined what a royal mistress could be, transforming the role from scandalous secret to respected institution. Her model of discretion, intelligence, and political partnership would influence how such relationships were conducted throughout the 20th century. She proved that in the right hands, the position of royal mistress could enhance rather than damage the monarchy. Now, let's cross the channel to France again, but this time to an earlier era and a woman whose influence was even more direct and brutal. Diane de Poitiers, mistress to King Henri II, who didn't just advise policy, she made it. For over a decade, she was the effective ruler of France, a woman who signed documents with royal authority, commanded armies, and shaped the destiny of a nation through pure force of will and strategic brilliance. Diane was 35 when she became mistress to 19-year-old Henri, a relationship that should have been temporary, youthful infatuation. Instead, it became one of the most politically significant partnerships in French history. Diane wasn't just older than Henri, she was infinitely more experienced, more educated, and more politically astute. She had been married to a powerful noble, had managed vast estates, and understood the mechanics of power in ways that the young king could barely comprehend. What made Diane extraordinary wasn't just her ability to maintain Henri's devotion despite their age difference, though that was impressive enough. It was her transformation of that devotion into absolute political control. Within months of their relationship beginning, Diane was attending council meetings, reviewing state documents, and issuing orders in Henri's name. Ministers who wanted royal approval had to court Diane's favor first. Foreign ambassadors treated her like a head of state. Diane's influence on French policy was comprehensive and transformative. She oversaw military campaigns, managed financial policy, directed religious affairs, and conducted diplomatic negotiations. When Henri was occupied with ceremonial duties or personal interests, which was often, Diane essentially ruled France. Her signature appeared on official documents with the same authority as the king's. Her orders were followed without question by ministers and generals. She was particularly influential in military affairs, a traditionally male domain where her involvement should have been scandalous. Instead, her strategic insights proved so valuable that commanders actively sought her advice. She planned campaigns, allocated resources, and even accompanied armies in the field. Her influence on the Italian wars shaped French foreign policy for generations. Through careful diplomacy and strategic military deployment, she helped establish France as the dominant power in Western Europe. Diane's domestic policies were equally significant. She promoted religious tolerance in an era of violent sectarian conflict, protecting Protestant nobles who might otherwise have faced persecution. She encouraged trade and commerce, understanding that French prosperity depended on economic growth rather than military conquest alone. Her court became a center of Renaissance culture, attracting artists, writers, and philosophers who helped make France the intellectual capital of Europe. What was most remarkable about Diane was her ability to maintain power even as she aged. Most royal mistresses were discarded as soon as their physical appeal faded. Diane, through careful political positioning and genuine usefulness, remained Henri's primary advisor and de facto co-ruler until his death. She had transformed herself from mistress to minister to monarch in all but name. Her fall came suddenly and brutally. When Henri died in a jousting accident in 1559, Diane's protection vanished overnight. The new queen, Catherine de Medici, had endured decades of humiliation while Diane wielded power that should have been hers. Catherine's revenge was swift and thorough. Diane was stripped of her properties, her positions, her influence. She died in exile, a woman who had ruled an empire reduced to comfortable obscurity. But Diane's legacy was more complex than her dramatic downfall suggests. For 20 years, she had demonstrated that effective governance didn't require male authority. Her policies had strengthened France, expanded its influence, and promoted cultural development that would endure for centuries. She had proven that political power could flow through personal relationships in ways that traditional structures couldn't accommodate. Let's shift our focus to a woman who wielded power from an even more precarious position. Lola Montez, mistress to King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who managed to bring down a government, trigger a revolution, and transform the political landscape of Central Europe through sheer audacity and political miscalculation. Lola's story is a masterclass in how quickly influence can turn to disaster when ambition exceeds judgment. Born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland, she reinvented herself as Spanish dancer Lola Montez, a persona that was part fiction, part fantasy, and entirely calculated to captivate European audiences. When she encountered Ludwig in 1846, she was already notorious for her scandalous performances, her fiery temperament, and her trail of abandoned lovers across the continent. Ludwig was immediately infatuated, not just with her exotic beauty, but with her apparent sophistication and worldly experience. What Ludwig didn't realize was that Lola's sophistication was largely performance. Her political opinions were half-formed prejudices, and her understanding of Bavarian society was virtually non-existent. Within months of becoming his mistress, she was demanding political influence that she was utterly unqualified to wield. Ludwig, besotted and increasingly isolated from his advisors, granted her requests with an enthusiasm that horrified his government. Lola's political intervention was catastrophic from the beginning. She supported liberal causes without understanding their implications, opposed conservative ministers without considering the consequences, and demanded reforms that threatened the very foundations of Bavarian society. Her salon became a meeting place for radicals and revolutionaries who used her access to the king to promote increasingly extreme agendas. The conservative nobility was outraged by Lola's influence, but their opposition only encouraged Ludwig to support her more enthusiastically. He made her Countess of Landsfeld, granted her vast estates, and began implementing policies based on her recommendations. Students rioted against her presence. Ministers resigned in protest. Religious leaders denounced her from pulpits. Bavaria was sliding toward civil war, and Lola seemed oblivious to the chaos she was creating. Her most destructive intervention came in educational policy. Lola supported university reforms that challenged traditional Catholic authority and promoted secular liberal ideas. While these reforms might have been beneficial if implemented gradually and carefully, Lola's demands for immediate, radical change triggered massive resistance. Students staged demonstrations. Faculty resigned. Parents withdrew their children from schools. The entire educational system was paralyzed. The crisis reached its peak in early 1848, a year of revolutions across Europe. Bavarian revolutionaries, emboldened by Lola's radical rhetoric and the king's obvious weakness, began demanding constitutional changes that would have transformed the monarchy into a republic. Ludwig found himself caught between his infatuation with Lola and his duty to preserve his throne. When forced to choose, he chose survival. Lola's exile in March 1848 was swift and ignominious. One day, she was the power behind the throne. The next, she was fleeing Munich in disguise while angry crowds demanded her head. Ludwig abdicated shortly afterward. A broken man who had traded his kingdom for a love affair that had lasted barely 2 years. Bavaria descended into political chaos that would take decades to resolve. Lola's legacy was complex and contradictory. Her political interference had been disastrous, triggering conflicts that might have been avoided with more skillful management. But her support for liberal education and democratic reform planted seeds that would eventually flower into progressive change. She had demonstrated that even incompetent political intervention could have profound historical consequences. Her story also illustrated the dangers of political influence without accountability. Unlike other royal mistresses who understood their limitations and worked within existing systems, Lola had tried to remake Bavarian society according to her whims. The result was revolutionary chaos that destroyed the very monarchy she had hoped to influence. Now, let's examine a woman who understood political power far better than Lola ever did. Gabrielle d'Estrées, mistress to King Henri IV of France, who helped end religious civil war, establish religious tolerance, and create the political stability that would make France the dominant European power for the next 2 centuries. Gabrielle's influence was exercised with surgical precision and strategic brilliance that put most professional politicians to shame. When Gabrielle became Henri's mistress in 1591, France was tearing itself apart in religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants. Henri himself was a Protestant who had inherited a throne that most of his Catholic subjects refused to accept. The country was bankrupt, divided, and on the verge of complete collapse. Gabrielle's challenge was to help Henri navigate these impossible contradictions while building a coalition that could restore peace and stability. Gabrielle's first insight was that Henri's Protestant faith, while sincere, was a political liability that threatened to make his reign impossible. She carefully encouraged his consideration of conversion to Catholicism, not out of religious conviction but from practical necessity. Her influence on his famous decision that Paris is well worth a mass helped secure his acceptance by Catholic nobles and clergy who controlled most of France. But Gabrielle understood that religious conversion alone wouldn't solve France's problems. She worked tirelessly to build bridges between Protestant and Catholic factions, hosting dinners where former enemies could meet in neutral territory. Her salon became a place where religious differences could be discussed without violence, where practical solutions could be developed through personal relationships. Her most significant contribution was her influence on the Edict of Nantes, the 1598 decree that granted religious tolerance to French Protestants. While Henri provided the royal authority for this revolutionary policy, Gabrielle helped develop the practical mechanisms that made it workable. She understood that tolerance had to be more than a royal proclamation. It needed institutional support, financial backing, and social acceptance. Gabrielle's economic insights were equally valuable. She recognized that France's financial crisis couldn't be solved through traditional means like raising taxes or borrowing more money. Instead, she encouraged policies that would stimulate trade, attract foreign investment, and rebuild the productive capacity that civil war had destroyed. Her support for infrastructure projects, commercial development, and educational reform helped lay the foundation for French economic recovery. Her diplomatic influence was more subtle but equally important. Through careful cultivation of foreign ambassadors' wives, she helped rebuild France's international reputation. European courts that had written off France as a failed state began to reconsider their positions as Gabrielle demonstrated that Henri's government was stable, moderate, and worth supporting. Gabrielle's personal relationship with Henri was based on genuine intellectual partnership rather than mere physical attraction. She studied military strategy, read diplomatic correspondence, and participated in policy discussions with an expertise that impressed seasoned ministers. Henri trusted her judgment on matters ranging from military appointments to trade negotiations. Her death in 1599, just as Henri was preparing to divorce his wife and marry her, was a catastrophe for French politics. Henri never fully recovered from the loss, neither personally nor politically. His subsequent relationships lacked the strategic partnership that Gabrielle had provided. The careful coalitions she had helped build began to fracture. The religious tolerance she had championed faced increasing opposition. Gabrielle's legacy was the stable, prosperous France that emerged under Henri IV. Her influence had helped end decades of civil war, establish religious coexistence, and create the political foundations that would support French greatness for generations. She had demonstrated that the right woman in the right position could literally save a nation. Let's turn our attention to a woman who operated in perhaps the most restrictive environment of all. Lady Castlemaine, mistress to King Charles II of England, who had to navigate the brutal politics of Restoration England while managing a relationship with a king famous for his fickleness and his collection of simultaneous mistresses. Barbara Villiers, later Countess of Castlemaine, turned what should have been an impossible situation into nearly 2 decades of political influence. Barbara encountered Charles during his exile in Europe, when he was a penniless pretender to a throne that Parliament had abolished. Her decision to align herself with him was an enormous gamble that could have resulted in permanent exile or worse. But Barbara understood that Charles possessed charisma, intelligence, and royal blood that would eventually prove valuable if the political winds shifted. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, Barbara's gamble paid off spectacularly. What made Barbara's position particularly challenging was Charles's refusal to practice conventional monogamy. Unlike kings who maintained one primary mistress and occasional dalliances, Charles surrounded himself with multiple women simultaneously, creating a competition for influence that could have destroyed them all. Barbara's genius was transforming this potential weakness into a source of strength. She became the unofficial coordinator of royal mistresses, managing relationships between rivals, preventing destructive conflicts, and ensuring that Charles's romantic chaos didn't spill over into political disaster. Her apartments at Whitehall became neutral territory, where other mistresses could meet, negotiate, and coordinate their activities. This wasn't altruism. It was strategic brilliance that protected her own position while making herself indispensable to the entire system. Barbara's political influence operated through careful cultivation of government ministers who needed royal favor, but couldn't always predict Charles's moods or priorities. She provided intelligence about the king's thinking, advanced warning about policy changes, and informal channels for communication that bypassed official protocols. Ministers who maintained good relationships with Barbara found their proposals received more favorable consideration. Her economic influence was more direct and controversial. Barbara accumulated enormous wealth through royal grants, property deals, and investment opportunities that her position made possible. Critics accused her of corruption, and they weren't entirely wrong. But Barbara understood that financial independence was essential for political survival. Mistresses who depended entirely on royal generosity could be discarded without consequences. Wealthy mistresses with their own power bases were much harder to dismiss. Barbara's involvement in foreign policy was particularly significant during the Anglo-Dutch Wars, where her pro-French sympathies influenced Charles's diplomatic positioning. She maintained extensive correspondence with French court figures, providing intelligence and advocacy that helped shape Anglo-French relations. Her influence on these negotiations was substantial enough that foreign governments considered her a legitimate diplomatic contact. What was most remarkable about Barbara was her longevity. While other mistresses rose and fell with their physical appeal or their ability to amuse the king, Barbara maintained significant influence for nearly 20 years. She achieved this through constant adaptation, political usefulness, and an understanding that her role needed to evolve as circumstances changed. Her decline came gradually rather than suddenly. As Charles aged and his political priorities shifted, Barbara's influence waned, but she managed her withdrawal skillfully. She secured her financial position, maintained her social status, and avoided the dramatic downfalls that destroyed other royal mistresses. When she finally left court, it was on her own terms rather than through royal rejection. Barbara's legacy was the model she created for managing complex political relationships in an unstable environment. She had proven that even in the most challenging circumstances, intelligent women could build and maintain political influence through strategic thinking and careful relationship management. Now, let's examine a woman who pushed the boundaries of royal mistress influence to their absolute limits. Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry, the last official mistress of the French monarchy, who wielded power during the final years of the old regime, and whose influence contributed to the political crisis that would eventually trigger the French Revolution. Du Barry's rise was perhaps the most dramatic of any royal mistress in European history. Born into rural poverty, she worked as a shop girl, a courtesan, and eventually a high-class prostitute before catching the attention of nobles who recognized her potential. Her beauty was extraordinary, but her real asset was an intuitive understanding of male psychology that allowed her to manage even the most difficult personalities. When she was introduced to Louis XV in 1768, the king was already elderly, cynical, and weary of the political pressures that had dominated his reign. Previous mistresses had tried to influence him through intellectual conversation or political partnership. Du Barry succeeded through something much simpler. She made him feel young, desired, and happy. In a court suffocated by protocol and ceremony, she provided genuine pleasure and uncomplicated companionship. But Du Barry's apparent simplicity was deceptive. Behind her charming naivety lay a shrewd political intelligence that understood exactly how power operated at Versailles. She aligned herself with ministers who supported her, destroyed careers of those who opposed her, and gradually built a network of influence that extended throughout the government. Her political intervention was particularly significant in foreign affairs, where her opposition to Austrian influence helped shape French policy toward its traditional enemies. Du Barry supported ministers who advocated for aggressive policies against Austria and Britain, contributing to the diplomatic miscalculations that would embroil France in expensive foreign wars. Du Barry's domestic influence was equally destructive. She encouraged Louis XV's natural tendency toward extravagance and luxury, supporting court expenditures that drained the royal treasury. Her own lifestyle became a symbol of aristocratic excess that outraged ordinary French citizens struggling with economic hardship. The infamous diamond necklace affair, while not directly involving Du Barry, was part of the culture of conspicuous consumption that she had helped create. Her relationship with the royal family was particularly toxic. The Dauphin Louis, future Louis XVI, despised her as a symbol of everything wrong with his grandfather's reign. The Dauphine Marie Antoinette, despite her own later reputation for extravagance, initially refused to acknowledge Du Barry's presence at court. The entire next generation of royal leadership associated Du Barry with the moral and political corruption they hoped to reform. Du Barry's influence on religious policy was particularly controversial. She supported ministers who advocated for reducing church power and influence, not from philosophical conviction, but because church leaders consistently opposed her presence at court. Her anti-clerical positions contributed to the breakdown in relations between crown and church that would prove catastrophic during the Revolution. When Louis XV died suddenly in 1774, Du Barry's world collapsed instantly. The new king, Louis XVI, exiled her from court within hours of his accession. She was stripped of her property, her position, her influence. For nearly 20 years, she lived in comfortable but powerless retirement, watching from a distance as the monarchy she had helped weaken stumbled toward its final crisis. The French Revolution transformed Du Barry from exiled mistress to hated symbol of aristocratic excess. Revolutionary authorities confiscated her remaining property, investigated her finances, and eventually arrested her as an enemy of the people. Her execution in 1793 was one of the Revolution's most symbolic acts, the destruction of a woman who represented everything revolutionaries claimed to oppose. Du Barry's legacy was complex and ultimately tragic. Her influence during the final years of royal authority had contributed to the political and moral crisis that made revolution possible. She had demonstrated the destructive potential of royal mistress influence when exercised without responsibility or long-term thinking. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and conspicuous excess. But Du Barry's impact extended beyond her personal failures. She had pushed the role of royal mistress to its absolute limits. demonstrating both the potential and the dangers of influence wielded through intimate relationships. Her career marked the end of an era when such relationships could be openly acknowledged and politically significant. Throughout all these stories, we see common patterns that reveal how royal mistresses accumulated and exercised power across different eras and cultures. First, intelligence always trumped beauty in building lasting influence. The most successful mistresses were those who understood politics, economics, and diplomacy well enough to provide genuine value to their royal partners. Second, discretion was essential, but not sufficient. Mistresses needed to be visible enough to demonstrate their influence, while subtle enough to avoid triggering backlash from threatened institutions. The most successful ones found ways to be acknowledged without being scandalous. Third, financial independence was crucial for political survival. Mistresses who depended entirely on royal generosity were vulnerable to sudden changes in royal favor. Those who built their own wealth and property had options that protected them during political transitions. Fourth, the most influential mistresses understood that their power was always temporary and conditional. The wisest ones used their influence to build lasting institutions, policies, or relationships that would survive the end of their personal relationships with kings. Finally, the most successful royal mistresses were those who enhanced rather than diminished royal authority. Kings kept mistresses who made them more effective rulers, not just more satisfied men. The women who understood this distinction were the ones who built lasting political legacies. The institution of royal mistress declined not because of moral reforms or feminist progress, but because of changing political structures that made such relationships less useful. Constitutional monarchies, professional bureaucracies, and democratic institutions created alternative channels for political influence that didn't depend on personal relationships with rulers. Modern politicians still maintain relationships that blur the lines between personal and political. But the days when a single woman could reshape national policy through strategic bedroom diplomacy are long gone. Today's power brokers work through lobbying, media influence, and institutional position rather than intimate access to decision makers. The legacy of royal mistresses is more complex than simple condemnation or celebration. These women operated within systems that gave them few legitimate options for exercising political influence. They used the tools available to them to shape policies, protect interests, and advance causes they believed in. Some did so wisely and beneficially, others disastrously and destructively. What remains consistent across all their stories is the demonstration that political power has always been more fluid, more personal, and more dependent on relationship dynamics than official histories suggest. The women who wielded influence as royal mistresses understood something that many modern observers miss. In any political system, real power flows through personal relationships as much as institutional structures. These women faced impossible contradictions. They lived in societies that denied them formal political roles while expecting them to exercise informal political influence. They were criticized for being too ambitious when they sought power and too passive when they didn't. They were blamed for royal failures while being denied credit for royal successes. They navigated systems designed to use them without acknowledging their contributions. Yet, many of them succeeded in reshaping their worlds in ways that extended far beyond their personal relationships. They promoted religious tolerance, supported artistic innovation, encouraged economic development, and influenced foreign policy in directions that affected millions of people. They did so while operating under constraints that would have crushed less determined individuals. The story of royal mistresses is ultimately a story about the unofficial ways that power operates in any society. Behind every formal structure of authority lie networks of personal relationships, private agreements, and intimate influences that shape how decisions actually get made. The women who mastered these networks didn't just influence their royal lovers, they influenced the course of human history. Consider the broader implications of their influence. Religious wars ended partly because mistresses encouraged tolerance and compromise. Cultural movements flourished because mistresses provided patronage and protection. Economic policies changed because mistresses understood trade and finance better than the kings they advised. Military strategies succeeded or failed based on advice whispered in royal bedrooms. Their methods were often morally ambiguous. They used seduction as a tool of statecraft, personal relationships as political weapons, and intimate access as a form of governmental authority. They manipulated, calculated, and sometimes betrayed in pursuit of their goals, but the same could be said of any successful politician in any era. The difference was that these women had to disguise their political activities as romantic relationships. The royal mistress system also reveals something important about monarchy itself. Kings who relied on mistresses for political advice were acknowledging the limitations of formal governmental structures. Official ministers might have technical expertise, but mistresses provided emotional intelligence, social insight, and psychological understanding that professional politicians often lacked. In many cases, royal mistresses served as informal ambassadors to social groups that formal government couldn't reach. They connected kings to artistic communities, intellectual movements, religious minorities, and emerging commercial interests that traditional aristocracy ignored. Through their salons and social networks, they provided information and perspectives that helped rulers understand their societies more completely. The decline of the royal mistress system paralleled the development of more sophisticated governmental institutions. As bureaucracies became more professional, as constitutional limits on royal power increased, as democratic participation expanded, the informal influence of royal mistresses became less necessary and less effective. But the fundamental dynamic they represented hasn't disappeared. It has simply moved to different venues. Modern political systems still operate through personal relationships, private communications, and intimate influences that rarely appear in official records. The techniques that royal mistresses pioneered, using personal access to shape political outcomes, continue in lobbying, social networking, and relationship building that characterizes contemporary politics. The women we've discussed tonight were products of their times, but they were also individuals who refused to accept the limitations that their societies tried to impose on them. They found ways to exercise political influence, despite being denied formal political roles. They shaped history despite being excluded from official historical records. They proved that power doesn't always flow through the channels that constitutions and organizational charts suggest. Their stories remind us that behind every major historical development lie countless personal relationships, private conversations, and intimate influences that shaped how events actually unfolded. The royal mistresses who controlled thrones understood something that formal historians often miss. Politics is ultimately about people, and people are always more complex, more contradictory, and more interesting than the institutions they create. When you walk through the great palaces of Europe today, when you visit Versailles or Schönbrunn or the Winter Palace, remember that the real decisions that shaped European history weren't always made in the throne rooms and council chambers that tourists see. They were made in private apartments, during intimate dinners, and in bedrooms where passion mixed with politics in ways that changed the world. The women who occupied those private spaces, who navigated the treacherous waters between love and power, who turned seduction into statecraft and influence into legacy. deserve to be remembered not just as footnotes to royal biography, but as political actors who shaped their world as decisively as any king or minister. These royal mistresses controlled thrones not through force or legitimate authority, but through intelligence, charm, strategic thinking, and sheer determination. They proved that in the game of power, the most important pieces aren't always the ones wearing crowns. Sometimes the real queens are the ones who never officially held the title, but whose influence echoed through generations. Their legacy lives on in every political relationship, where personal connection shapes policy outcomes, where informal influence matters as much as formal authority, where the whispered conversation changes more than the public speech. They showed us that power is always more personal, more fluid, and more dependent on human relationships than any constitutional framework suggests. The royal mistresses who controlled thrones were queens without crowns, rulers without titles, politicians without portfolios. But they were undeniably powerful, undeniably influential, and undeniably important to understanding how political authority actually operates in any human society. Their stories are ultimately our stories. Tales of ambition, intelligence, and determination that transcend the particular circumstances of monarchy and speak to universal truths about power, influence, and the complex ways that human beings shape each other's destinies. In the end, these women remind us that history is always more complicated, more personal, and more interesting than the official version suggests. Behind every throne stood not just a king, but often a woman whose influence shaped how that power was used, whose intelligence guided critical decisions, and whose legacy extended far beyond the private relationships that gave her access to authority. They were the secret queens of Europe, the shadow rulers who operated behind silk curtains and whispered policies that changed continents. Tonight, you've glimpsed their world, understood their methods, and seen how personal relationships can reshape political reality. Their stories are finished, but the dynamics they mastered continue in every corridor of power where human relationships shape human destiny. Remember their names: Pompadour, Dolgorouki, Keppel, Poitiers, Montez, d'Estrées, Castlemaine, du Barry. Remember their achievements, their failures, their brilliant strategies, and devastating miscalculations. Most importantly, remember that they proved something that formal political science often forgets. In any system of human authority, the most important influences are often the most invisible ones. The royal mistresses who controlled thrones understood this truth and used it to reshape their world. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond official structures and formal titles to understand where real influence actually flows in our own political systems. In that sense, their stories aren't just historical curiosities, but guides to understanding how power really works, yesterday, today, and tomorrow.